This is 10.2, evolution by natural selection. We're going to be talking about Charles Darwin a little bit, talking about the four principles of natural selection. All right, who is Charles Darwin? Charles Darwin is or was an English naturalist. He was born in 1809. Dates aren't important. I just like history. And he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species, which is instrumental to our understanding of evolution by natural selection. He went on a voyage on this boat, HMS Beagle, and he was brought along as the naturalist, as a conversation partner for the captain, and it was a 5-year-long trip around the world, and at many ports of call, Darwin was able to gather fossil evidence and species from all different parts of the world, and as he did so, he began to make connections between them. He began to kind of realize that things seemed to kind of, make sense, like different environments or the same kinds of environments all over the world had similar kinds of species and so forth. And as he began to make these kinds of connections all over the world, he gathered fossils, which preserve remains of old organisms. And he made a stop here, of course, famously at the Galapagos Islands. And the Galapagos Islands are interesting because they're volcanic islands, and each one of them has their kind of this microcosm type ecosystem where they're almost like these self-contained units because they kind of came along at different time periods in history. And he noticed the birds on the island in particular, but also the tortoises and a few other things, were particularly suited for the environment that they lived in, and they had specific adaptations for those environments with beak size and color and all these different things that was going on for them. And that's how he began to kind of make these connections that we're going to talk about as we look at the principles of natural selection. He noticed that these organisms must have changed over time in order to match their environment, which kind of had to do with Lyell as well, right? Not Lyell. Lyell talked about the Earth, but the Earth is changing. Perhaps the species that live on the Earth were changing as well. He published these works in a book called On the Origin of Species, one of the most influential books ever written. And there's a copy of it. It's a pretty boring read, but it's one of those things. You should probably check it out. And what are those principles of natural selection? He came up with 4 basic ideas. Before we talk about natural selection, though, we do need to talk about artificial selection, which is kind of the opposite of that. Artificial selection is where we humans actually select the traits that we desire in an organism. Domesticated dogs are an example that's used all the time. I like it because they came from wolves. Wolves are wild. They're mean. They're all the things that we don't want in a dog, right? We want dogs to be domestic. We want them to be docile. We don't want them to chew our faces off while we sleep. And so we picked animals that tend not to do those things. And then we kept picking them, and now we have things that are just barely even doesn't even close to resemble what they came from. We have some dogs that are closer to the wolf, right? But then we have some that fit in people's bags that barely should be called dogs. All right, so let's talk about natural selection. Of course, this is happening out in nature, and the main driver behind natural selection is death. That's it. Organisms die. The ones that don't die survive. There are 4 principles associated with natural selection. Here they are. The first one is natural selection is there is variation, meaning that there's going to be variations in a particular population. This is a population of black bears. Black bears aren't always black. There's a lot of variation in that population. Some of those variations are likely to be better than other variations. Some of them may be completely neutral. With black bears, they're seemingly neutral. But some of them may not be at all. And what would you expect to happen if some variations are better than others? Well, some organisms are going to be better able to adapt, right? Adaptation is just the characteristics that allow an organism to survive in its environment. As the environment changes, you'd expect animals to then adapt to that environment. Not by choice. It's not as if they're saying, we should probably get together and do this. But the ones that can't adapt die, right? The ones that do adapt live. And that ability to live in the changing environment is called fitness. Fitness. Fitness is not just the ability to survive, however, it's also the ability to reproduce. And so make sure you tie those 2 things together, not just survival, but reproduction. Woolly mammoth's a great example of an organism that had fitness at one point, right? Was able to live and thrive and move and do its thing. And then as the environment changed, it decreased fitness because it wasn't able to adapt to the changing environment. It is now considered extinct. And so that is an example of that. All right, so moving on. Next principle is overproduction. What is this? This is kind of Malthus, right? Remember Malthus said that populations have this ability to reproduce. And so, in fact, they have ability to overproduce, meaning that not all the organisms that are born are going to be able to survive. Right? A great example is fish. Fish lay thousands of eggs without the idea that thousands of those fish are going to live to adulthood. In fact, many of them won't get out of the egg stage. What's the idea? Well, they're not all able to survive, right? There are things that are going to prevent them from surviving, which we'll get to in a minute. But populations have the capacity to grow exponentially. Exponential growth is essentially where a population doubles in size every generation, to where eventually the graph is just kind of going straight up. All populations that aren't limited by anything will grow this way, including our own, which we're currently less exponential growth, but after the Industrial Revolution, human population pretty much has grown exponentially. And so, yeah, what's the next one? Struggle for existence. If populations grow exponentially and there are limited resources, which there are, then there will be a struggle for existence, right? And I put the picture of the plant there because I think the plant is important, because normally when we think of a struggle for existence, we think of the picture on the right with the lions and the hyenas fighting it out. Obviously, they're struggling for existence as well, but so is that plant, right, that is struggling in this dry environment and has to deal with the limited resource in this case, which is rain, and has to then adapt in order to deal with that limitation. Speaking of those limitations, we call them limiting factors. Limiting factors are what create the struggle for existence. If there are no limiting factors, there is no struggle. And so a population size is going to be limited by those factors. It's going to be different for different populations. Obviously, for human populations, human disturbance is not one for us, but for hyenas it might be, or lions it might be, or that plant it might be, right? Predation, you could add any of these. These are all limitations on a population that those members of that population must overcome in order to survive. There's going to be a struggle. The ones that struggle and win are going to succeed. What does that mean? It's number 4, differential reproductive success. Not everyone is able to survive and reproduce. Not everyone has fitness. Those that do are going to reproduce and they're going to succeed. Why is that success? Because those genes that were the biggest, fastest, strongest, in the case of the bear here fighting for mate, they're fighting each other for mates, probably not food, probably mates. The biggest bear, the strongest bear is going to win those rights, and those genes are then going to get passed on to the next generation. That is what we mean by differential reproductive success. It could be food, it could be anything, right? But the ability to obtain the most energy, the ability to get the best mate, that's going to equal reproductive success. And this is what causes evolution. Evolution is a change in a population over time. Very simple definition. Change in a population over time. We're going to increase or change that definition a little bit in the coming lectures, where we're going to talk about how evolution is a change in the allele frequency. Remember alleles from Unit 9? Allele frequency over time. But simply put, evolution is a change in the population over time, and that change is driven by natural selection.